All right, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for joining us. I'm Gabe Horowitz with Third Way. A few years ago, supply chains went from this very technical business school term to something that was on the front page of every single newspaper. And that's because midway through the pandemic, our supply chains got turned completely upside down. There was a time when we had 100 container ships stuck off California's coast waiting to dock. And trains were backed up for 25 miles outside of my hometown of Chicago, waiting to access the rail yard. And a quarter of agriculture exports were being lost due to supply chain issues. Well, this pandemic, economic crisis, it just wreaked havoc among global supply chains. Now, luckily, the Biden administration, private sector efforts, a lot of stuff has worked to free up those supply chains. But there are constant challenges, from the war in Ukraine, tension with China, climate disturbances, and antiquated regulations and red tape. So we're going to get into all of that this morning, and I am really excited to explore how supply chains are currently faring, what government and private sector actions have worked, and then the future of trade and where we go from here. So first, we're going to get an update from Jake Colvin, president of the National Foreign Trade Council. Jake oversees the council's work expanding access to the global economy, and he really knows the role of trade when it comes to solving complex global problems. Following Jake, we'll have a great panel that digs into these issues, and then we'll end with some insights from Congressman Don Beyer. So without further ado, let me turn to Jake. Jake, thanks for being here. Would love your thoughts at the top.
Hey, Gabe, thanks very much for hosting the discussion today, and more broadly for the Third Way's recognition of the importance of America's leadership in the global economy. As President Biden said when he was a candidate, when it comes to trade, either we're going to write the rules of the road or China is, and not in a way that advances our values. Historically, the United States has been a leader in writing the rules of the road for trade facilitation. And those policies that we've implemented here at home, we've then written into our trade agreements. And they improve the ability of American businesses and workers to benefit from the global economy. And they also support compliant and resilient supply chains. And so prior to the pandemic, we'd seen sort of decades of industry and government commitment to trade facilitation, and from a number of countries, not just the United States. So those efforts culminated in the passage of this global trade facilitation agreement at the World Trade Organization. And I'm excited that today's discussion will feature Dawn Shackelford, who was instrumental in that effort when she was at USTR. And USMCA included even more robust commitments between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. But fast forward, and now 3 years since the pandemic, it feels like we're at an inflection point when it comes to global trade policy. Both because of the pandemic, but also, you mentioned the geopolitical tensions. These things have contributed to global inflation. They've obviously had a strain on global institutions. And they've caused countries to reevaluate their approaches to trade policy. As we think through what that new normal looks like for trade policy in the United States, I think it's critical that we don't forget how important trade facilitation is in helping American businesses and workers, and how much U.S. leadership matters to getting it right. It's particularly important because as other countries have become more aggressive in writing those rules of the road on trade, there's a threat that the United States will lose out if we don't get it right. And so between 2016 and 2022, the U.S. share of world exports fell from 8.6% to 7.8% in manufacturing, and from 10.4% to 9.3% in agriculture. So last summer, the Third Way released this report on trade facilitation, which detailed how cutting red tape creates jobs in every state in America and promotes competitiveness by cutting the cost of exporting to the United States. And so I would encourage you all to read or reread that report. And while, NFTC, we're a trade association and we advocate for an open rules-based global economy on behalf of US-based multinational businesses, we've also engaged thousands of American small businesses over the past 15 years through our Global Innovation Forum. And small businesses that ship physical goods regularly cite customs red tape as the biggest challenge to exporting. A renewed commitment to trade facilitation, both by the private sector and government, will strengthen relationship with our allies and also provide structures for resolving disagreements and helps with supply chain dependability and diversified sourcing. So really appreciate the Third Way's leadership and work on this. I'm looking forward to the discussion this morning, and including hearing from Congressman Beyer. As a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, he's been a strong supporter of lowering trade barriers and promoting Congress's oversight of trade policy. So look, Gabe, thanks again, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you for that, Jake. I'm going to ask our panelists to turn their cameras on. Nothing warms the heart of someone at a think tank than someone telling other people that they need to go read their paper. So I'm really glad Jake brought up the trade facilitation. We're going to get into that in this conversation for sure. Let me welcome our panelists, though, to this virtual stage. Let me just tell you who we've got with us. We've got Laura Baughman, President of Trade Partnership Worldwide. We've got John Pickle, Senior Director for International Supply Chain Policy at the National Foreign Trade Council. And we've got Dawn Shackelford, Executive Director for Trade Agreements and Policy at the Department of Commerce. So guys, thank you. Welcome, welcome. Really excited to have you all. I want to start, John, I'm going to turn to you. I want to start with kind of the current state. It seems like supply chains have rebounded from the worst part of the pandemic, but there's still issues. We still see these issues cropping up every week in the press. What's your take? What's the current state of supply chains right now?
Well, thanks, Gabe, and thanks for hosting this event. I will say that I agree that the pandemic and other disruptions showed that supply chains are long, fragile, but also inherently resilient. We did see quite a quick bounce back in terms of the ability to supply the American consumers and businesses with the products that they need. That's largely a result of industry adapting to constantly variable conditions. Government did what it could. I think there were a lot of examples where government agencies leaned forward. And there's also a lot of great case studies in how to further strengthen the ability to respond to those sorts of disruptions. I was in government during the pandemic and some other disruptions that you alluded to. And I can tell you that the relationship between government and the private sector, responsible companies partnering with U.S. government agencies across the USG is key to identifying and taking action on issues that will actually make a difference. Trade facilitation as a concept addresses many of the challenges that we've experienced and will likely be omnipresent in the future. If we're talking about environmental concerns, let's streamline automation and processing at ports to reduce idling trucks. If we're concerned about trade disparity, let's enable American exports by lowering transaction costs and other barriers to trade. Change is going to be constant. Supply chains evolve on a minute-to-minute basis without much exaggeration. So the ability to build in an element of future-proofing, of anticipating that change, and really leaning on that relationship between responsible U.S. industry and government partners is going to be the foundation going forward.
That's really interesting. I actually want to focus in a little bit on one of the points you said about a bunch of government and private sector action that's already happened. Dawn, I want to turn to you, and then Laura, I want to bring you in on this. You know, when we think about government actions that have helped untangle these supply chains the most, what are you looking at? What are you most proud of that either Commerce or USTR or other acronyms in this big wide government have done over the past couple of years?
Sure. Thanks, Gabe, and thanks for hosting this. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about these issues. So on the part of government, we are looking at trade facilitation through both the border measures as well as some of the behind the border measures. And Jake had mentioned earlier the WTO trade facilitation agreement. And we have really been working on the part of the US government to ensure full implementation of this agreement. It entered into force in February of 2017. And some of its key provisions we've been making some great progress on. We're at about 70% of WTO members, which includes most of the major economies, have notified what's Article 1.4 of the agreement, which is all of the information on how to import, export, and its transit procedures for the member countries, which is really valuable information for exporters. We've seen approximately 75% of members have notified to the WTO their contact points for the exchange of customs information and the use of customs brokers. And almost 60% have notified their operation of their single window. So we see these as key progress points that we've significantly engaged with other countries on to advance these border-related measures. But We also are seeing a lot of behind the border measures, and we did see some progress during COVID. So, as the US government, we were encouraging trading partners to be innovative, streamline, develop temporary regulatory policies to facilitate the movement of essential goods associated with public health. And we did see a number of countries do this. The WTO reports that members suspended or relaxed authorization, certification procedures for PPE, other medical supplies, and vaccines. This allowed the use of IT tools to conduct remote conformity assessment procedures, and the countries relied on regulatory cooperation by, for instance, accepting test results from internationally accredited labs. It's too early to tell if any of these measures will become permanent, but we are doing our part to really encourage members to make these type of facilitative measures permanent going forward. Thanks.
That's fascinating. Laura, what else would you add to that? What other either government actions, beyond what Dawn mentioned, or private sector actions have you seen that have really helped untangle supply chains?
Well, I work a lot with U.S. companies that export and import into the United States and abroad in different countries and globally, and they all tell me pretty much the same thing, which is that these trade facilitation initiatives that we have, that Dawn mentioned, that Jake mentioned, are really, really important in getting rid of a lot of the bottlenecks that would clog up supply chains. The red tape is not to be underestimated as a problem, and the trade facilitation agreement at the WTO, the new provisions in the USMCA, any trade agreement that seeks to get rid of those is extraordinarily helpful to U.S. exporters. Also, the thing that I've been hearing from companies is that their ability to work cooperatively with the government, and in particular customs, over implementation of initiatives like forced labor legislation is also really key to keeping supply chains moving. There's a lot of confusion and complications associated with, for example, the implementation of the the various forced labor initiatives that are out there, but in particular the Uyghur one, UFLPA or whatever the acronym is. And it's got people tied up in knots in many respects. And so the degree to which the companies are working closely with customs in an effort to figure out how that can be best and most effectively implemented in commercially meaningful ways is very, very important. So I know they appreciate the cooperation and the input they're able to have on that score.
Laura, I want to stay with you because you and John and Dawn all mentioned trade facilitation, which sounds a little jargony, sounds a little in the weeds. I call it reducing the red tape on trade when talking to folks on Capitol Hill and throughout government. And you've done a lot of analysis on this. We've put out a paper together. Jake hinted at that earlier. I would love if you could just tell the audience here a little bit more about what trade facilitation would mean for U.S. jobs and competitiveness, and tell us a little bit more about your work there.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Gabe. And thank you so much for putting these wonky numbers into regular English. That was a fascinating paper for me to read. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to have helped to contribute a little bit to it. One of the things that we did is we looked at the various red tape barriers in all the different countries around the world and attempted to devise what's called a tariff equivalent. If those red tape measures were a tariff in country X, what would that tariff be? And then we compared, and then we looked at, well, what would happen if that red tape tariff went away? How much would U.S. exports increase? So that's basically the idea. And one of the things that we found is that there are a number of countries who have done a lot to get rid of red tape, like Korea, Australia, Canada. And so the tariff equivalent of that barrier to U.S. exports is actually really low. But then there are a lot of other countries where the tariff is in the double digits. And so what we said, okay, is, well, we found that overall this tariff equivalent is on the order of 6.3%. That compares to an actual tariff of 2.6% globally. So you can see how much bigger red tape is as a cost to US exporters than even just straight up tariffs in most countries around the world. It's like 3 times bigger. So it really matters if we can get rid of that red tape. It really matters to US exporters. So the question we asked is, okay, well, what if all the countries with high red tape reduce it to the US norm? You know, if our approach to trade facilitation were the norm for the world as a whole, what would that mean for US exports and US jobs? And we found that it would increase US exports by 88 billion. And that increased export business would equate to nearly 1 million US net jobs in the United States. Thousands of those jobs are going to be unionized jobs. Thousands are going to be available to workers with nothing more than a high school degree or less. Small businesses would account for 79% of those new jobs. So a lot of bang for that buck.
The numbers were eye-popping to us, and I think it's such an interesting concept. I want to kind of build on this. Dawn, I want to go to you, and then John next. You know, we've talked about trade facilitation and about a lot of things that government has done here. I'm curious about looking ahead. What else needs to be done? What is Commerce thinking about? What's the Biden administration thinking about to make sure more supply chains are resilient for the future?
Sure. Thanks, Gabe, and thanks, Laura, for the overview on the numbers there. So I would say the Commerce Department specifically has been quite focused on building out the supply chains and what can the government do in terms of building out supply chains, making sure that they are resilient. So you saw at the very beginning of the administration, the executive order on America's supply chains, and Secretary Raimondo now co-leads President Biden's supply chain disruptions task force. She's working closely with the White House's port envoy to develop action-oriented policies intended to alleviate port and supply chain congestion. I'd also note in 2023, so this year, the administration released a report card outlining the actions that have been taken to support the supply chain work, and that includes the CHIPS and Science Act, which was signed into law in August of 2022. So we've got further implementation of that going on. The department's first notice of funding opportunity for manufacturing incentives, and we're creating ITA's supply chain center. And there was an award of $500 million in department funding to 32 coalitions through the Good Jobs Challenge to support high quality, locally led workforce systems. So those are all things that we have in train and that we are working on right now. So they'll continue in the future. I would say through the various conversations that I have been having with industry about what is most important to them, what are some of the challenges they're seeing in this space, I hear a lot about de minimis and small packages. And I hear a lot about concern of what could potentially happen if countries start charging duties on digital transmissions. So in the kind of the trade facilitation space, whether that be in our bilateral conversations with our trade agreement partners or the WTO, those issues of the small packages and the digital transmission duties are probably some of the things we are talking about the most right now.
Interesting. John, what would you add to that? So Dawn's put a lot on the table there in terms of different actions. Any of those that you would give a shout to, or anything else that she missed?
No, absolutely. I would say that each of the examples that Dawn gave are great examples where there's been a great amount of dialogue between U.S. industry and the government writ large. I would just add to that I think that is a theme that needs to continue, and kind of adding on to sort of the overarching initiatives that Dawn mentioned. So much when we talk about trade facilitation comes down to cross-border movement of goods, right? And so when we look at processes like automation that incorporates things like e-invoicing and payment capabilities that were highlighted in the third wave report, as well as identifying areas where government information sharing can be better, and adopting more comprehensive trusted trader principles to facilitate that cross-border movement of trade, as so many different agencies have the ability to exercise regulatory authority on products coming into and going out of the country. I think some of those nuts and bolts sort of considerations are going to be necessary to make sure that we are making the most of the opportunities that are being created within the broader constructs that Dawn outlined.
Great. You know, I want to, supply chains is obviously a key part of why we're here today. I want to expand the scope of this conversation a little bit more and think about the future of trade. Now, we've heard from leaders at USTR that they are not as interested in tariff cutting deals at the moment as some past administrations have been. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that nothing is going on. There are efforts underway in the Indo-Pacific, in Latin America, on Taiwan, critical mineral agreements. I'm sure I'm forgetting about 5. I'm curious, though, I want to ask all 3 of you, are we seeing a new paradigm for trade policy? And I'm curious whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And Dawn, why don't we start with you, since you've seen both from the USTR lens and now at Commerce. Are we kind of in a new era for trade?
I would say we are, Gabe. And I guess first off, and Laura kind of touched on this point, that tariffs still matter, of course, but as Laura was saying, you know, these border measures, this red tape that you're seeing, this is a key hindrance for our traders to exporting. It is what is causing a lot of expense for our exporters. So while tariffs still matter, there are all of these other issues that I think the administration is trying to address through some of these different trade engagements that you're seeing they're not the traditional market access agreements. They don't have the tariff cutting. They don't have the GATS, you know, services schedules in them, but you are seeing this focus on some of these, whether they're the border measures or behind the border measures, as central. So what I think the administration is trying to do here is strike this balance between ensuring that countries do have a right to regulate, but encouraging our trading partners to avoid implementing measures that are more trade restrictive than necessary. So within the Commerce Department, working closely with USTR and our interagency colleagues, we have been pushing issues at the WTO through the TIFAs, through other bilateral engagements, through these new types of agreements, where we're pressing our trading partners on some of these regulatory issues. So to give a couple examples, I think a number of the industry representatives would be familiar with China's overly burdensome and discriminatory cosmetic regulations. We've been pushing for clarity on Indonesia's expansive halal requirements, which go far, far beyond food products. We're pushing for enhanced transparency and clarity on Indonesia's on India's wide range of quality control orders that we're seeing. And we're also, with some of our other trading partners, trying to figure out how do we talk collectively about issues like plastic packaging, cybersecurity, good regulatory practices in a way that is not going to be putting up barriers for our trading partners. We're witnessing the emergence of new trade barrier trends and trying to figure out how to tackle these. We've been seeing a real increase in export restrictions, for example, on scrap metals and critical minerals. And these measures may have long-term consequences for supply chains. So I think we're trying to figure out how to address those in some of these new agreements potentially. And there's also a number of other issues that go beyond tariffs, such as we think it is correct to focus on these issues that go beyond tariffs and the market access. Given that the U.S. is the global standard, though, in this area, in terms of ensuring that we have open borders, we have an open regulatory system that others can comment on. We do need to ensure that we have the leverage necessary to convince our trading partners to adopt these kind of practices, so that we have our exporters can enjoy those same benefits. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much. Really interesting. John, let me turn to you, and then I want to end with Laura. Kind of building off what Dawn said, are we seeing a new paradigm? And if so, do you like it?
So I agree with Don. I think it is a new paradigm as it's being approached currently. I will say I think engagement is inherently important. Ultimately, industry wants to see commercially meaningful deals. That can take many different shapes and can be substantiated using many different metrics. Ultimately, though, there does need to be, from the industry perspective, a tangible outcome in terms of the ability to execute business operations in other countries and ease the flow of trade. I think there are also other opportunities where FTAs might also make sense in this paradigm. For example, the United Kingdom would make a lot of sense sort of from a strategic perspective. And we could talk more about that for a long period of time, probably. But I think a more diversified approach is something that merits thought as well.
Thanks. Really appreciate that. Laurel, I'm going to end with you, and then we're going to turn it over to the congressman. Any final thoughts on the future of trade?
Oh, wow. That's a huge conclusion. The future of trade. There is a future for trade, and it depends, I think, in many ways on us writing the rules right, getting the rules right, and then helping U.S. companies to know what those rules are and to engage through those rules. U.S. businesses are very resilient. They will adapt to pretty much anything, but they need to know what they need to adapt to. And there are, of course, some rules that are less helpful than others. And I think it's important for policymakers everywhere to listen carefully to what U.S. business has to say, because they really know what's going to work and what isn't going to work. And I think that also helps to keep the supply chain greased, because there are no surprises out there that clog up the works in the short run until you can get back in and fix the finer points of a particular proposal. So the other thing too is to remember that we can't really, we have to recognize that resilience requires the United States to welcome engagement with multiple economies around the world as part of our supply chain. We can't have all of our eggs in the US basket or all of our eggs in the Chinese basket. We need diversification, and that's the only way we're going to have resilience, is if we embrace that notion.
Perfect summation, Laura. Thank you so much. I have about 50 more questions I would like to ask the three of you, but our time is tight today. So I'm going to end our panel portion here. John and Laura and Dawn, thank you guys so much. I learned a ton today. Really insightful comments. Appreciate all your guidance on these issues. What we are going to do next is turn it over to Representative Don Beyer. Congressman, really appreciate you joining us this morning. Congressman Beyer is the senior House Democrat on the Joint Economic Committee and a key member on the House Ways and Means Committee. Also, much more close to home, he's the newest representative to the entire Horwitz family that just moved down into your district. So really thrilled to be down in Alexandria. Congressman, welcome. I know you don't have long, but we'd love your insight. And one topic that we were just discussing was the future of trade. And let's just continue that. I know USTR has told you, others in Congress that they're not interested in tariff cutting deals at the moment, but they're still doing a lot of other deals and engagement. And I'm curious your thought if we're seeing a new paradigm for trade policy, and I'm curious whether you like that or not.
Well, Gabe, first, thank you for inviting me to be part of it. I only caught the last 10 minutes of your panel, but I agreed with almost everything that they said, and it was really interesting to see. I feel I'm just piling on with their wisdom and insight. Welcome to Alexandria.
Thank you.
It's a terrific thing. And just as clear disclosure, I've sold international nameplate automobiles for 46 years. Volvos, Land Rovers, Subarus, Mazdas, Lotuses, Kias. And so I come to it with a natural bias towards the idea that since the liberalization of international trade after World War II, mankind has grown in economic wealth and quality of living and lifespan more than any time in history by far. And what's driven this more than anything else is international trade. So I just confess my bias. To your question, yeah, I respect, but I am disappointed that this administration is not interested in any of the tariff cutting deals. for a lot of different reasons. But that doesn't mean that there isn't anything going on. The Indo-Pacific framework, for better or worse, all that we're trying to do in Latin America, the initiation of the lowercase free trade agreement with Taiwan, and the critical minerals agreements that are being negotiated all over the world. New paradigm, I think it's probably too early to say that. It's certainly a different paradigm than what we had before. How long it lasts, I'm not sure. It's interesting. While Catherine Tai and the president have talked about swinging away from trade deals made solely on corporations and executive branch and leaving out workers, we've also seen as an administration is moving towards trade deals made on the executive branch, leaving out Congress. So there's, we can't even spell TVA anymore. And I'm glad that they're moving ahead with the initiatives. Again, I'm not part of the dealerships anymore. I sold out to my little brother, but opening up the EV sales and the incentives through these critical mineral agreements is going to really help speed the transition to electric vehicles. It's going to help on climate change a lot, even if some of our domestic manufacturers don't like it. But I worry about what's being left on the table when we leave the traditional congressionally authorized trade agreements aside. Now, Gabe, let me confess, as broken as the House is right now, I understand why they're doing it. When we can't pass a budget or even a continuing resolution, why do we think we could pass trade agreements? But we will, to the larger point of the administration, USTR Ambassador Tai, trying to bring workers in, I sometimes feel that they miss the fact that when you do great trade deals, then all of our corporations have the resources to raise the environmental standards, to raise worker pay. That workers are part of all these corporations. So, and without the dispute settlement mechanism that we had in USMCA, we may not get the agreements that we were looking for, the kind of progress that we were.
Yeah,
It's a very mixed bag.
I want to follow up
on the one hand, you can appreciate the worker part of it without figuring out how they're going to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to follow back up on the politics of this in the House in a second, but I'm curious before we get there, current state of supply chains. We saw years ago how they were completely turned upside down. We've seen them get better in a lot of sectors. You talk to a lot of different industry sectors, a lot of different areas in the country come before Ways and Means. What's your take on the current state of supply chains? Are you feeling good about them? Or are you worried?
No, Gabe, I'm really pretty optimistic about it. I made the comment many times during the pandemic that so many of the things that happened in the pandemic, including the inflation and the like, were the result of businesses making millions or even billions of small decisions that on a day-to-day basis to try to keep their business flowing and profits maximized and people employed. And the same thing has happened now with the supply chain disruptions. We've made so many small decisions that have helped sort that out. Again, I know the car business best. Yes, there are shortages, but nothing like we had before. We're able to get lots and lots of cars flowing. I think there's 14, 15 million new cars sold in America this year. That's not far off of the 16.5 million records that we've had before. So those are good. The only hesitation is the war in Ukraine and the spillover effects and what that means to the global supplies and the tension with China. I know we're trying to onshore as much of friendshore as much of the Chinese stuff as we can, but they're our second largest trading partner now that Mexico's over coming up. But still, it's a huge, huge deal. And as long as they represent to our consciousness what the Soviet Union did in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the great enemy, it's going to be, the possibilities for disruption are very real.
Yeah. Let's circle back to the House. Let's circle back to politics because you raised it, not me. It's a little bit difficult to move things right now in Congress. I'm curious what you think, and let's look beyond the next 2 weeks and a potential shutdown. But for the rest of this Congress, what do you think can get done on trade, supply chains when it comes to this divided government and frankly a far right that may be doing things differently than Republicans have done in the past?
It is pretty scary that the Republican Party has become, and not just as fringes, there's a big swath over there that's anti-trade.
Yeah.
That looks at globalization and technology and blames trade agreements for everything that's happened to American workers. And they sort of miss the fact that American corporations have had record profits year after year after year. We have more billionaires than ever before. The wealth is ever more concentrated at the top, and we left workers out. But it wasn't trade deals that left workers out. It was management and how we've made our priorities. Just the difference between executive pay and the average worker is, many times greater than it was when I was growing up. And that's and the fact that with the rising exception right now, labor's had so very little negotiating power for the last 30 years. Not that I'm cheering for a summer of strikes like we just had, but there were a lot more strikes in the 1950s and 1960s. As a consequence, the middle class is an awful lot stronger. I'm thrilled that Chairman Jason Smith is putting GPS count or GSP. I think we actually have a hearing on it tomorrow. I'm disappointed that it's September before we've finally gotten around to doing something we should have done in January. We still need to do MTP, the miscellaneous tariffs bills. AGOA should be very possible to do this year. The Hope Health preferences for Haiti are due to expire soon. We should and could act on them this year. We got so hung up in the last Congress not being able to move forward on things like GSP or MTB because of the administration's insistence on getting different trade adjustment assistance and things like that, for the workers. And so as a consequence, nothing happened. I certainly hope we're leaving some very important trade tools on the table right now because we can't act it.
Well, I will take the optimism on a Tuesday, Congressman. We don't often hear a lot of optimism, but I agree. I think there's a lot that we can and should do. In the few minutes that we have remaining, are there any other final priorities of yours that you're going to be looking to continue to shine a light on and continue to advance that we haven't talked about yet today?
I think probably the biggest thing from a Ways and Means perspective is reasserting congressional trade authority. I was proudly one of the 28 that voted for TPA back in 2015, 2016, of the Democrats that voted. The fact that the administration's doing a lot of things on its own without Congress, the critical minerals agreements, we fashioned that Taiwan bill, which passed overwhelmingly in Ways and Means and in the House because we wanted to, at least retrospectively, put a congressional blessing on the things that Ambassador Tai was trying to do. If we look ahead, I'm still upset about the 232 stuff that Donald Trump did and inherited from Ron Kind, whom we miss, the idea that the president should not be able to just say the words national security and slap tariffs on whoever he wants. Mike Gallagher is leading the bill. I'm the co-sponsor, so it's bipartisan. And hopefully we can make progress on that. Also, I'm leading the issue on permanently waiving the tariffs and trade barriers on infant formulas. There's almost no industry more onshore than baby formula, 2 manufacturers in the United States. So you get a blip in that, and all of a sudden our babies can't eat. And it's been bad policy. We have good policy out there. I hope we can do that too.
It's a great list. Congressman, I want to thank you. You mentioned you were one of the 28 in TPA years back, and honestly, throughout your entire career on Capitol Hill, you've always been a leader on these issues. We urge you to keep it up, and we really appreciate all you've done, not only for the international trade community, but just for supply chains in general, and appreciate your vision, your leadership. I know you've got to get back to all the business. Let's try to keep the government going. And again, I want to thank our panelists again for their time, Jake Colvin for his comments this morning. And again, we will continue to opine and bring together thoughtful voices on this and would love to stay in touch in the months and years ahead. Congressman, thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabe, for the invitation. Good luck.
Take care, everybody.